Hey guys, so some, many, most, and all. In this lesson, we're going to break down the existential quantifiers. This is another skill lesson, but you guys are really going to gain a lot of points from this because existential quantifiers are found in more than 50% of logical reasoning questions, and they're also found in RC and logic games. In this lesson, we're going to learn what they are, what's the difference between these and universal quantifiers, and then also how to use them on test day. So first up, what is an existential quantifier? Okay, an existential quantifier defines something I call the ladder of certainty. That's something we've definitely come across throughout this course so far, and if you've taken a practice test, then you've definitely come across it as well. The ladder of certainty tells us how certain can we be about something. Okay, how sure are we of our evidence, of our conclusion? What proportion of the population are we talking about? It's something that ties very directly into scope. So let's begin with a basic example and see what we can learn from it. I've got up here, some law school students use max, most law school students use max, and all law school students use max. For the first one, some law school students use max, that's pretty ambiguous, isn't it? All that's saying, in the literal sense of the LSAT, is that at least one law school student uses a max. That's our first existential quantifier. It's some. Some really tells you nothing besides not none. Okay, so let's expand on that. Let's say you live in a 5-person household. If I say some people in your household use max, that could be 1 or 2 or 3 people or whatever, right? If I say some people in the world use max, then I could be talking about 1 or 3 people in the world using max, but I could also mean like 30 million people use max. So some really doesn't give you any kind of definitive number. It should only be taken to mean not none. Now the second one, most law school students use max. What does that tell us? Again, not very much, just that more than half do. But in terms of absolute numbers, this is still pretty undefined. If you're in a group of 100 people and you say most of that group likes mangoes, then you could have 51 people liking mangoes or 99 people liking mangoes or anywhere in between those numbers. Where the LSAT gets you is they try and get you to assign numbers and make a stretch from a relative relationship, such as some and most, to an absolute relationship like all or none. Okay, you can't do this. You have to stay within the confines of like relativism that these existential quantifiers give you. Now for the last one, we have all law school students use max. This one you can explicitly define because it's an absolute, not a relative. Both sides of this spectrum, all law school students use max or no law school students use max, tells you definitively how many people use max. There's no guesswork involved and therefore you can make an absolute conclusion. Where you guys get kind of screwed over though is the difference between how the LSAT is testing and using these words and how we use them in day-to-day life. Okay, so think about this. If I came up to you and I asked you to give me a couple of grapes, you'd probably hand me a handful of grapes, right? Yet the literal thing I asked you for is what, like 2 grapes? Right? If I asked you instead for a few grapes, again, you'd probably just hand me a handful. But a few just means, right, more than 3, if we're being literal here. Yet if I asked you for some grapes, you could either hand me 2 grapes or like a whole bunch of grapes. Okay? And you'd be within the confines of some. You'd be correct. You'd be literal. Some and many and most are very commonly tested within LR stimuli, especially the harder questions in logical reasoning. And what the test writers want you to do is they want you to ignore these words and just blow past them, which is kind of what we do in our day-to-day life. Okay, that's the trap. If I were to ask you for some grapes, you probably wouldn't ask me to define how many I would exactly want. But these words on this test are so important. And the reason is we can't go up our ladder of certainty. Okay? For example, if I have evidence saying some pre-law students take the LSAT, I can't go up a rung on my ladder and say with certainty that most law school students take the LSAT, no matter how logical that may be. Okay? Why? Because your premises need to back up your conclusion. If you only have evidence for some, then you don't have enough evidence to conclude most. Okay? So we can't go up our ladder of certainty. But we can go down it. So if I say all pre-law school students take the LSAT, then it's fine to conclude that some pre-law school students take the LSAT because I can go down my ladder of certainty. It's valid. If I know 100% of them, I can say 2% do as well. Okay? If I know all or most law school students take the LSAT, then it is 100% factual. It's valid to conclude that at least some have, right? Okay? So to kind of wrap this up, all implies most. okay? And most implies many, and many implies some. You can climb down, but you can't climb up, okay? It is possible for some or most to imply all, but it's valid. It could be true. It's not valid, right? And an argument that could be true is a bad argument, okay? So for some is defined as more than one. I want you to compare that to all, which is a universal quantifier, right? The word all is a universal quantifier. That's a group 1 universal quantifier. Some just gives you a range. It can be 1 or 2% of your set, or it can be 100% of your set. It is ambiguous. It gives you options. But that second thing I just said, I think, is where a lot of students fail with existential quantifiers. Some can imply all. It just doesn't have to. Let me give you an example on how some can imply all. If I have a statement saying some smoking products are bad for you, but then later on I realize that all smoking products are bad for you, then my first statement wasn't technically wrong. I was correct to say initially that some smoking products are bad. I just didn't clearly define how many. I said that because I didn't have the evidence yet to conclude that all were bad. I was playing it safe because for all I know that maybe there's a smoking product good for you, like a vitamin vape or something. I don't know, and that would be a good argument. Absolutes like all are generally hard to prove because if you find just one exception to it, it's now wrong. My first statement is true because the sum that I had experience with comprised a sum of a whole. The sum that I encountered were bad for you, and that's why some can imply all. Okay, so if you can understand something like that, then you are most definitely thinking like a 180 score. If not, rewind and listen to it again. I know that it's kind of a lot. Okay, for now, we're going to go on to many. So many is definitely something that the test writers like to screw with you on, because a lot of the times in day-to-day life, we think of many as meaning a lot of something, but it doesn't have to be. Like, I would ask you this, if I say I have many friends, what do I mean? Like, say I have 3 friends. Maybe to me that's a lot if I'm kind of like an asocial person, but maybe you're a social butterfly and to you 3 friends is nothing. So our many here is very subjective. So we're not going to agree in that scenario on whether or not I have many friends. But what we would agree on is that I have at least some friends. So what can we imply if I say I have many friends? We can imply that at the least I have more than one friend. Anything past that is subjective. Don't fall for that trap, guys. Now, what about other words like several, a few, a certain amount? Well, a few means 2 things, not most and some. Okay? If I say I have a few Apple products that are bad, then what that means is 2 statements. Number 1, most Apple products are not bad. And number 2, some Apple products are bad, right? These things go together, kind of like a biconditional if you've watched my conditional logic lesson, okay? So words like several, a few, a certain amount are just unknown. They're the most ambiguous because they just mean an unknown amount greater than 0. Be especially careful with these. I've definitely spent some serious time breaking down stimuli where students were tripped up trying to apply some definite amount to words like few or a certain amount, okay? Now, to really understand these guys, I want you to start thinking of them as subsets, okay? So I told you that some implies most, implies all. Why can't we go in reverse, right? Well, most is a subset of some. So there is a part of some that is not most. Okay, so here's an example. I can say this. Most pizza is tasty. Some pizza is Hawaiian, but there can be any variation of overlap there. Think of it kind of like a Venn diagram. With this statement, as I have it given to you, we can have 3 scenarios of overlap. Number 1, all of the Hawaiian pizzas are tasty. Number 2, some of the Hawaiian pizzas are tasty. Or number 3, none of the Hawaiian pizzas are tasty. Okay, so let me give you some numbers to make that maybe make sense. Say I have 100 pizzas. 51 of them are tasty, right? We said most pizza is tasty, so 51 of my pizzas are tasty. 10 of them are Hawaiian, okay? Those 10 Hawaiian pizzas can be within the most subset, okay? And you could have 10 of the 51 being tasty Hawaiian pizzas. Or maybe only 8 of the Hawaiian pizzas are tasty, okay? And the other 2 are not. Or maybe those 10 Hawaiian pizzas are in the subset of 49 untasty pizzas, okay? So we've got some overlap there that's ambiguous. And I think that's a good example to fall back on if you get confused on test day or in practice. So back in our conditional logic and universal quantifiers lesson, we covered negations as part of our chat about contrapositives, okay? The concept behind negation is definitely pretty simple. If my original statement is I like cookies, then the negation is I don't like cookies, all right, which is stupid. Because besides that, we had some rules on what could be negated. Like if we're negating a conditional relationship, you also have to flip. And we were able to kind of intuitively figure out why you have to do that using some examples, okay? Negating existential quantifiers is probably a little less intuitive, but we still have rules for it. So let's break it down and I'll try and make it as easy as possible for you guys. For the first one, we want to negate sum. Okay, well, let's take a look back at what the definition of sum is. Sum is defined as at least one. Well, how would we negate at least one? It would be not at least one, which put into less clunky words is none, right? Not at least none equals none. So that one I think is definitely pretty easy. Okay, so the negation of some of my friends like chocolate cake would be none of my friends like chocolate cake. Okay, now to negate all, we again should take a look back at the definition. All means 100%, right? 100% of your set falls within this all category. What's the negation of that? Not 100%. Now, that doesn't mean none. I think a lot of people think the negation of all is none. It means not all or some are not, right? Not all or some are not, which is definitely the correct way to look at it. I think that some are not actually really is the best way to look at the negation of all, some are not, okay? So why is the negation of all not none, okay? Because there's a difference between the logical opposite, aka the negation of something, and the polar opposite of something. The logical opposite, the negation of all, is not all. The polar opposite of all is none, okay? Logical opposites just seek to negate something. The polar opposite is just the complete opposite side of the spectrum, which has little to no use on test day. Okay, think about it like this. The polar opposite of cold is hot. The logical opposite of cold is not hot. It could be comfortable. Okay? Again, that's definitely something that you should sear into your brain because it'll take you farther on test day. Next up, we have most and none, which are definitely tricky. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at these. Most negated is most are not. Okay, let that sink in for a second. Most are not. The negation of most is most or not. So what does that mean? Well, the negation of most can include some, as long as some is less than most or none. Okay? None negated is going to be some, because the negation of none can include some, most, or all. Why? Because some implies most and all, so it's all encompassing, right? The negation of none is just not none. Okay, so one or above. Okay? But what's the difference between these and a contrapositive? Okay, well, the negation is the logical opposite, right? The contrapositive is the logical equivalent. The negation, logical opposite, contrapositive, logical equivalent. Okay, we've covered pretty in depth how contrapositive works and how to use them to get conditional logic questions right. But negation by itself is not something we've really seen before. Okay, so what's its usefulness? Well, a lot of the times on your test, you have to contradict a statement, usually in the answer choices to check if you're right. For example, when we get to your necessary assumption lesson, the way we check your answer choice is we negate it. If the negation destroys the conclusion, then you've got the right answer. But if you don't know how to negate existential quantifiers, you'd never be able to do this. Okay, so, that's the usefulness, that's the practical side of existential quantifiers, guys. This is most definitely a heavy lesson. This and universal quantifiers definitely, I think, trips people up. I don't think if you have to watch this lesson 2, 3, or 4 times, that's a problem, right? Definitely make sure this is something you understand because it's found throughout the question types. Okay, this is something you want to master before you go into a beast like flaw or weaken or necessary assumption. Okay, so hopefully you guys left this lesson understanding existential quantifiers. If not, shoot me a message and I'll try and help you out. I'll see you in the next lesson.